Furthermore, the more time passes, the weaker their position gets. If you look at World Bank data on real GDP, purchasing power parity, you see that the members of the OECD's, the Rich Countries Club, total GDP is $50.9 trillion while the rest of the world's GDP is $127.3 trillion. That means that even if all the rich countries allied themselves with the Hazarian faction ruling the US, they would have less than half the economic power of the BRICS alliance. Things only get worse for the US once you realize the numbers used by the World Bank are based on lies put out by the US government. For example, if you look at US government data, it says that prices in 2016 are only 35% higher than they were in 2001. That is because the US government has changed the composition of the basket of goods it uses to measure inflation over 20 times to make the inflation rate look lower. If you look at more realistic measures of inflation, you will see that US prices are 160% higher in 2016 than they were in 2001. Since the inflation rate is used to calculate GDP, what this means is that real US GDP is worth less than half of what it was in 2001. If you look at industrial production figures, you can see that US industry has not grown since 1976. Then there is the fact that 22% of the US workforce worked in manufacturing in 1977 versus only 9% in 2016. What this means is that most Americans are working in the service industry as public servants, or bank clerks or in restaurants, and are not making anything that they can trade with the rest of the world. That is why the US has been running a trade deficit almost non-stop since 1976. That is also why the US is the most indebted nation in the history of the planet. Again, you can see this by choosing Max in the link below. This cumulative trade deficit has left the US owing the rest of the world more than $19 trillion. If you look at the Rothschild-controlled G7 group of countries as a whole, you can see they owe the rest of the world $47.1 trillion. What this means is that the G7 countries have been on a degenerate path for the last 40 years. The cause of this degeneracy can be traced back to the Nixon shock of 1972, when President Richard Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard. Until 1972, the developed countries were experiencing strong economic growth under the gold standard. However, after Nixon dropped the gold standard, the G7 countries just started printing money out of thin air and using it to buy stuff from the rest of the world. This is the financial equivalent of using amphetamines. You get a huge immediate burst of energy, but you are destroying your body in the process. The G7 reliance of fiat money turned them into huge parasites on the rest of the world. The rest of the world is now having an immune reaction against this parasitical infection by the Hazarian-controlled G7 countries. They are sick and tired of the continual antisocial behavior of the Hazarians. The United States is the world's worst rogue nation and has been at war almost non-stop since the end of World War II. The recent destruction of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya etc. by the Hazarian Mafia and their puppets has shown the world their true nature. Not only that, but the Hazarians have tried on multiple occasions to start World War III. For this reason, most of the world is no longer willing to finance the countries they control. It is true the US and the G7 have a more powerful military capability than China. This is especially true of the US Air Force and Navy. However, remember that at the beginning of World War II, Japan had a stronger navy than the US. However, US GDP was 4 times bigger than Japan's and the US had twice the population. That meant that as soon as the Americans began retooling their economy for war, it was only a matter of time before the Japanese lost. Now China has 4 times the US population and produces 20 times more steel, the basic ingredient for weaponry. That means that if the Chinese decided to go for all-out militarization, then it would be a matter of time before they won any conventional war. Even with NATO, the Americans would not have the ability to win a war against China now, and they know it from all the simulations they have carried out. Even if the US tried all-out nuclear war, the Chinese can put most of their population in deep underground shelters, whereas almost all Americans live in wooden houses and have no access to such shelter. To prevent a total Chinese victory, the Americans have been courting the Russians and the countries around China to join them in an anti-Chinese alliance. However, the Russians remember what the Americans did to Yugoslavia and what they are now doing to the Ukraine, and rightfully shun such an alliance. Not only that, they have actually agreed to carry out joint military exercises with China in the South China Sea. Furthermore, the European nations are also sick and tired of US behavior and are moving towards an alliance with Russia. In other words, the US under Hazarian rule has already lost World War III. So, what can be done to prevent China from totally dominating the planet? The answer is very simple: remove the Hazarian mafia from their final power bases in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Once this horrific infection has been removed from the US and world's body politic, then the US can start to negotiate with the rest of the world to create a more equitable global architecture. In terms of population, the Chinese account for 20% of the world, so that is the percentage of world power the Chinese would get if an inclusive world system was set up. This would replace the Rothschild and Rockefeller-owned, pseudo-world government known as the United Nations. Many people object to the idea of a world government because they associate it with the New World Order plan for a hazard.